Journalists Andrew Ferguson, John Podhoretz, and Henry Olsen. Three mellow pros on Uncommon Knowledge now. Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. A longtime journalist and columnist and a graduate of Occidental College, Andrew Ferguson is now a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute here in Washington. His work has appeared everywhere. Commentary, the Washington Free Beacon, the Atlantic, the New Republic, the Washington Post, the New York Times. You can't go into a dentist's office without finding work by Andy Ferguson. And of course, the Weekly Standard, where he served as a senior editor for more than 2 decades. In 1992, Andy served as a speechwriter for President George H.W. Bush. His books include Crazy You, One Dad's Crash Course in Getting His Kid into College. He is now working on a book on Richard Nixon. The journalist and political analyst Henry Olsen is now a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center here in Washington, a columnist for the Washington Post, and a lecturer at Hillsdale College. Henry holds an undergraduate degree from Claremont McKenna and a law degree from Chicago, which the three of us have to treat him with great deference for. Henry's books include The Working Class Republican, Ronald Reagan, and the Return of Blue-Collar Conservatism. Henry is famous most recently for predicting Trump's victory almost exactly right, although even Henry was surprised that Trump won Michigan.
I have to admit that.
Another longtime journalist and columnist, John Podhoretz, is the editor of Commentary magazine and host of the daily Commentary podcast. John began his career as a journalist here in Washington with the Washington Times and later became one of the founders of the Weekly Standard. John has a regular column in the New York Post. He served as a speechwriter in both the Reagan and George H.W. Bush administrations, and his books include Hell of a Ride, Backstage at the White House Follies. All right, boys, what just happened? This election, 2 quotations. Former Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi in an interview with the New York Times. I don't see this election as an outright rejection of the Democratic Party. Some of the Democrats are saying, oh, we abandoned the working class. No, we didn't. We are the kitchen table working class party of America. The fact is, we're set up for what comes next. Henry Olsen on a recent Ricochet podcast. What we've been seeing in voter registration data is historic. People have been moving to the Republican Party and abandoning the Democratic Party in record numbers. This was an R+4 election. That makes it an R+ election for the first time since 1932. Nancy Pelosi says it was a little bump. Henry disagrees. Henry, explain yourself.
This is historic, is that we've had for over 90 years, every election, the Democrats have more people who's behind them. Republicans have been fighting uphill since Franklin Roosevelt beat Herbert Hoover. That's not the case anymore. And that's why Kamala Harris lost, is that for 90 years, all the Democrats had to do was rally the base and split the independents, and they win the presidential election. She rallied the base, she won the independents, and she lost by 1.5 points. Why? Because there are more Republicans than Democrats. And why are there more Republicans than Democrats? Because for the last decade, they've seen the Democratic Party doesn't represent them, and that the Donald Trump-led Republican Party might. That's a sea change.
Okay, so this is not the nation rising up to reject lawfare. It's not a one-off. There's something more substantive and more permanent that just took place, and it was very, very big. Correct?
Yes.
Now, how do you calculate? By the way, after talking to you on the Ricochet podcast, I thought to myself, wait a minute. When you say it was an R+4 election, that means there's data that indicate, you were
the exit poll says that 35% of Americans who voted say they're Republicans, 31% say they're Democrats. That's
it's as simple as that.
It's as simple as that. The Fox AP poll says it's R+5. So they both agree that there's substantially more Republicans than Democrats. And that's the first time since the 1930s that that's the case.
Now, I'm going to stick with Henry for just a moment. The other aspect of this that we discussed on that Ricochet podcast that I'd like to follow up on, I have you here to myself, Henry, boys, I'll call you when we're ready for it. Henry and I are ready for you. So voter registration, an R+ election for the first time since 1932, huge, not a one-off, not entirely based on the personality and trials and travails of Donald J. Trump, something deeper happening. You also made the point that the change in ethnicity in people who now consider themselves Republicans is, again, one of these subterranean tectonic shifts. Starr County, am I remembering that correctly?
Yes.
On the Rio Grande, right at one border of the county is the Rio Grande. It's between Laredo and Matamoros, 97% Hispanic, and Trump carried it by?
I don't know exactly the number, but he did carry it. And this is a place that was historically Democratic. It was a Democratic vote sink. These counties on the Rio Grande were historically Hispanic. They were the place where LBJ stole the 1948 Senate election with his bag of votes. And not only did they move directly towards the Republicans in 2020, they moved even more. And now they're not a Republican vote sink, but now these are Republican areas. And you saw the change in Hispanic communities across the country. Yuma, and people talk about the Texas border. Well, the other crossing point is Yuma. Yuma had the largest swing. Arizona had the largest swing towards Republicans of any county in Arizona. It's also massively Hispanic. Imperial County, right next door to Yuma in California, largest swing in California to a Republican candidate. Hispanics of all ethnicities switched on a dime. And 8 years ago, we were told Donald Trump and the Republican Party is going to lose Hispanics forever because they're going to hate him on immigration. Actually, immigration and his desire to control it and restore jobs to their households and order to their neighborhoods is the number one issue why Hispanics said, I'm going to give this guy and his party a chance.
What happened to the Jewish vote?
Jewish vote, we have very unreliable data. Some exit polls say it didn't move towards the Republicans, others say it did. But if you look at any congressional district or county that has a significant Jewish population, you saw a big move. Rockland County is the largest.
Rockland County, New York.
Yeah, Rockland County, New York, 30% Jewish, went from basically 50-50 in 2020 to 14 points for Trump. That's got to include a move among the Jewish population and not just the ultra-Orthodox Jewish population. You're talking about normal, non-Hasidic, Reform, conservative, even some secular Jews who have moved to the right inferentially during the Trump years.
Black vote.
Black vote was a small increase, but still, when you get 13%, as the exit poll said, that's the largest share of the black vote for a presidential candidate since Gerald Ford in 1976.
Okay, boys, I put it to you. We will come to Donald Trump because we have no choice but to come to Donald Trump. And then, of course, to what the administration all of this we will come to. But here's what I found myself thinking after this conversation that I've just reconfirmed with Henry, that for a quarter of a century, the central question in American politics, in the life of the nation as a democracy, has been whether identity politics would trump the usual interests and principles on which people vote. Would we, as George Will once wrote, would we end up conducting not elections but censuses? All the white people vote one way, all the African Americans vote another way, all the Asians. And that, to my mind, that represented a real threat to democracy, to the functioning of the democracy in this republic. And in this election, we got an answer. Identity politics will not trump, not in any permanent way, trump people's ordinary calculations of their personal interests, the principles they want to advance, the kind of lives they want for their children. So again, we come to Donald Trump, but something remarkable and important and quite glorious just happened. Did it not, Andrew?
Well, that depends on your point of view, Peter.
Well, what is your point of view?
Context, you need context. You need historical background. I'm, the old cliche, there are no permanent victories in politics. I still remember the despair among Democrats in the late 80s, early 90s. We were never going to win an election in the Electoral College. And then this governor comes out of Arkansas, Bill Clinton, who actually understood what had happened to the Democratic Party and how it had started to peel away from its base, right, and become this sort of elite bastion. And he figured that out, and he won 2 consecutive terms and had a very successful presidency, if you don't count the impeachment.
Yes, right. Aside from that bit.
So, and people started to think, well, if you're a Democrat, Democrats are thinking, okay, we've made it, and now we've picked the lock, and it didn't happen. And so I'm a little skeptical of any kind of long-range speculation.
John, you take heart from this, however.
Well, I do. I mean,
let's corner Andy into the pessimistic.
I think there's a broader story here, which is Democrats were the majority party in the United States for
almost a century.
But of course, that was a very loose definition. Being a Democrat was something that had a very loose definition. How do we know that? Because from 1968 until 1992, one Democrat was elected president in, 6 elections? And that was the result of a crisis inside the Republican Party owing to Watergate.
Post-Watergate, right.
So when Ronald Reagan was elected, winning 40 states in 1980 and 49 in 1984, if you ask that question of pollsters in the exit poll, Democrats were 44% of the electorate and Republicans were 22% of the electorate. So explain to me what it meant to be a Democrat in 1980. It meant that you could vote Republican with almost nothing. You were a Democrat because you were a Democrat. It did not have pull on you necessarily. And structurally, the House of Representatives and the gerrymandering that was done for the House institutionally kept the House of Representatives in Democratic hands for four decades. Right. But that was not true of the Senate, which of course can't be gerrymandered since there are 2 senators per state. And so in 1980, you could have this wholesale 12 senators coming in with Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan has the Senate until 1986, loses the Senate. Republicans regain the Senate in 1994. They kind of lose it in 2000. Then they get it back in 2002. Then Democrats take it back in 2006. Like, the whole point that I'm trying to make is that partisan definition was a very loose thing. Over the last 20 years, it has become a tighter thing and more
the parties have sorted themselves out ideologically?
Yes.
Is that what you, right?
Yes, and I would say in terms of identity, it means something. It means way more to be a Republican or a Democrat now than it did for our parents. It is one of the defining qualities of who you are, that you say you are a Republican or that you're a Democrat. And as that has happened, I think it has been a necessary adjunct that the Republican Party has risen and the Democratic Party has fallen.
Why is it necessary? Why do you say necessary?
Because the Democratic Party is the party of the center to the left. The Republican Party is the party of the center to the right. And this is not a left-wing country. And it has never been a left-wing country. And
so the country finally, to paraphrase one of your mom's wonderful phrases, the country finally joined its own side.
Right. Well, thank you, and thank you for quoting my blessed mother. What I think is that over the last 20 years, the breakthrough book on this topic was The Big Sort, published in 2004, which said people were literally physically gravitating to places where they lived with people who were like them. Now, that has always been true, right? I mean, people lived in ethnic neighborhoods because they needed, Italians live with Italians, Jews live with Jews, Irish people live with Irish, Polish people live with Polish people. But as those identities faded, the idea that it was intolerable to live in a liberal community if you were a conservative rose. But why was that? That was that the identity of being a liberal started defining you way more than it used to. In other words, you could be a liberal Democrat, but you were a Catholic, you lived in Boston, you still went to church every Sunday, and the Reagan voter in Macomb County, Michigan, who was a Catholic and nominally a Democrat, but voted for Reagan, was your next door neighbor, and you had way more
No
in
problem.
common with him than you had differences. And over the 2 generations that followed them, America's cultural changes began to define the country. And those cultural changes sorted people into ideological categories, and then they wanted to live in places where they were not confronted with lattes, or they wanted to live in
So,
a place
Henry-
where people go to church.
Henry, what do you make of this notion that the country, John points out that the country is fundamentally center-right, and as the Democratic Party, as the Democrats become more consistently, homogeneously liberal, of course they separate themselves from the country, and that what happened in this election was that the country, again to quote Midge Decter, the country joined its own side.
Yeah, well,
Is that sensible?
I think
Is
it
that a
depends on
sensible
what you mean
description?
by center-right. That there are a lot of people in the Republican establishment who always took that to mean economically, and there's not a clear sense that what
Reagan was center-right.
Reagan was center-right, not right of center, which is to say that within the context
What's
of
FDR to you?
FDR is one of the great disruptors of American politics.
But is he center-right?
No, FDR was left of center.
Okay,
But
all right.
what FDR did was change America's understanding of its relationship of the citizen to government. What Ronald Reagan did was interpret that to readmit ideas of liberty and self-government into the conversation, as opposed to the reigning narrative from 1932 to 1980, which was, if there's a problem, we can trust on government to solve it. Government experts can solve poverty. Government experts can eradicate prejudice. Government experts can eliminate the cycles of the business cycle. And what Ronald Reagan said was, no, they can't do that. But we're not going to go back to 1928, where there's no such thing as Social Security, there's no such thing as environmental. And that meant
what happened 2 weeks ago?
What happened to what the
3 weeks ago.
what the Democratic Party has been doing is moving farther to the left, particularly on culture, but also across the board, than the American people want it to go. They don't want a culture of Cambridge University quads shoved down their throat in their schools. They don't want a government that is trying to bring about a green revolution that's going to put their jobs and their standard of living at risk. They don't want a government that cares particularly more about foreigners through trade, immigration, and foreign wars than they do about their own citizens. So they've said no to that Democratic Party. What gets created in its place? Well, if you think that this is a return to classic Reaganism, you will see a waste of that opportunity, just like Obama wasted his realigning opportunity after 2008.
I think. Well, we're talking about the Hispanic vote.
Yes.
So we look at this, we say, okay, Hispanics.
But excuse me,
Yes.
you're onto something.
Okay.
Aren't we? Don't we all want to take some heart from the notion that the Hispanic vote moved?
Yes.
To some extent, the black vote.
Identity
Politics don't define our democracy.
But that's the point that I was going to try to make, which is there's all this talk about the Hispanic vote. They're more conservative, and they go to church, and they don't like trans issues and things like that. And I accept that. So, but on the one hand, one of the things identity politics is that it erases the essential Americanness of everybody. So what was the experience that everybody had over the last 4 years? Inflation. Everybody in the United States experienced inflation because inflation hits it is inescapable.
Everybody buys groceries.
Who escapes inflation as a deep personal cost? Well-to-do people. The wealthier you are, the less effect inflation has. The more middle class to lower middle class to working class you are, the more inflation is a confiscatory tax on your paycheck.
Right.
Hispanic voters, not as well-to-do as the Democratic base, let's say, of course they voted to vote the bums out. Their paycheck was worth 20% less in 2023 than it had been in 2019.
Well, in that
they
case,
were
you
just
can't
acting
really-
as Americans,
You can't make a realignment case then, because 20% increase in groceries and the price of milk and stuff presumably is a one-off.
Right.
And we're not going to see that again. Question is then, do we have another resort after this huge calamity of inflation
Yes.
is taken out of the equation. The other thing that
But what it
isn't
does-
mentioned enough is that the Republican Party also moved to the left, which is it got rid of abortion as an issue. They tried to make it an issue, the Democrats did. It's quite clear that Trump has no interest whatsoever in abortion as a moral issue or a political issue. Gay marriage was completely ceded, which was as recently as 16, 18 years ago, was being used by people like Karl Rove to gin up the base and get the Republicans to the polls. That's all gone. So the Republicans had to move to the center or to the left if they wanted to win an election.
But a theory, what was disproved and why we should celebrate this is a theory of the electorate that should be discarded, which is that people align themselves with their identities rather than with their personal circumstances. That they have a vowel at the end of their name is more important than what is in their bank account. And that is something that is extraordinarily, bizarrely, but extraordinarily difficult for Democrats and liberals to hear, because it has been their governing assumption for the last generation that we all, and it was so prevalent that I think we were all a bit hypnotized by it too. He attacks a judge. He says the judge can't be fair to him, Trump, because he's a Mexican. And, he's going to do this. Well, that's it. Right. Or Tony Hinchcliffe, the comedian, makes a joke about Puerto Rico being an island of garbage. Oh, well, you got 500,000 people from Puerto Rico and Pennsylvania. Right. He's done. And it turns out that idea is just wrong. It is a misunderstanding of the voter. The voter is an American, and most important in terms of immigration and why this is so hard for people to understand, including me. I don't really understand. Every voter in the United States is a legal resident of the United States. What is more important? Does a Cuban from a person of Cuban origin from Miami think that because somebody speaks Spanish in El Salvador that they should be allowed to cross the border and live here illegally? That is illogical in the extreme, but somehow, again, we were so marinated in this idea culturally.
It's done.
I think it's done. Now, it's not done for them, though. It's not the people that we don't agree with on this, it is going to have to be wrenched out of them. It's like,
but let's not
they're like Stasi agents, they're going to return to Stasi headquarters after the Berlin Wall has fallen because they don't know where else to go to work. They don't have another understanding of America outside of identity politics. They're going to have to reconstruct it.
Andy, now we come, as we must, to the person of Donald Trump himself. This one is for Andy. I'm going to set it up, as I did the last segment, with a couple of quotations. Trump as a political figure. This is Charles Cook, our friend Charlie Cook in National Review. On policy, Trump has some advantages over Harris, especially in the realms of illegal immigration and the judiciary, but he is a long, long way from being a conservative, and his egotism, poor discipline, and lack of attention to detail make the prospect of a second term an alarming one. Trump is a man. This is Andrew Ferguson. You may have heard of him in The Atlantic. He's up at 4 a.m, tweeting strange and incomprehensible things, giving answers 12 and 14 minutes long, repeating himself at his own press conferences. I'm always astonished to discover that the president isn't a drinker. Andy, how could a man who answers to Charlie Cook's description, and indeed to your description, possibly have won such a consequential election?
Well, that assumes that it's...
you're not granting...
that it was consequential and an epochal sort of...
How could he have won such an election that is deemed consequential by 2 out of 3 of my guests?
You are asking the wrong person, because I simply don't know. I mean, I find him just personally so repugnant that I could... but that's just,
are you a never-Trumper?
Yeah, I'd say so.
Oh, you are?
Probably, yeah. Do I have to go now?
No. But now you become of archaeological interest to us.
Go make money off it. What's the matter with you? You're sitting here You know, if you're
You
going to
should
be
be
a
on
never
CNN.
Trumper, if you're a never
Should.
Trumper, you
I
should be
should.
starting committees and raising $1 million a head
I've been
to
angling
attack
for that.
Rupert Murdoch. That's what Rick Wilson is doing. The never Trumper,
I've got
is a
an
business.
internship at the Bulwark coming
There
up.
we go. Okay, there you go.
Okay,
There you go. It's a cash category now.
Here's a list of things that occurred within the first 72 hours after the election. My notes, anyway. The stock market reaches new highs. Corporate executives announce they will begin returning production to this country from China. Mexico begins discouraging caravans headed toward our border. Qatar evicts Hamas leaders from its territory. Europe announces that it would begin purchasing natural gas from the United States instead of Russia, while Putin announces that he's ready, that's the way it got translated, ready to speak to the US, and President Xi of China states that he wants peaceful coexistence with us. How can we not describe this man as a consequential figure?
Well, the causality there, the causal chain that you're trying to propose is kind of rickety. I mean, I acknowledge that he's got a kind of idiot savant political genius and a sensitivity to parts of the population that have either been totally ignored or misunderstood by the establishment of politicians in the country. You know, you're leaving a lot out there. In the same 72 hours, he nominated Matt Gaetz to be Attorney General of the United States. He's got another talk show host to run the Defense Department, a guy who, so far as we know, has never even run a Kiwanis Club meeting. There's a long string of them. And, you know, that is direct causality right there. He did that himself. So I just think it just strikes me, we want to make him a genius because he's a winner now. He's been a loser in the past, he'll be a loser again, but I don't want to go overboard.
So I don't want to, I mean, we could get mired in the person of Donald Trump when we want to move, of course we want to move to policy, how will this affect this town? But at the same time, everything you say I can't disagree with. On the other hand, look at the story. This guy is dragged into one court after another. He's shot. He emerges, fight. He feels epochal.
I want to blend.
Go, blend.
I want to blend.
Be the
I'm
great
gonna do the weave.
synthesizer.
I'm going to do the weave.
Do the weave.
Here's my weave.
Be the Hegel at the
My
table.
weave is.
That means he's going to talk for the next 45 minutes.
No.
My weave is that
Henry,
these two things come together.
Okay.
This election was a rejection of the last 4 years, which were in policy terms disastrous across the board. They were disastrous in domestic policy, they were disastrous in cultural policy, they were disastrous in energy policy, they were disastrous in foreign policy. And the public, very similar in this sense to 1980, looked at what the administration and the presidency and the Democrats in charge of the House and Senate, they weren't in charge of the House, but okay, looked and said,
Not this.
we got to get rid of these guys. That dovetails with the move that Henry has described to the right, to the Republican Party. Biden's victory, maybe like Carter's victory in '76, would therefore be a kind of outlier as a result of exogenous circumstances. Nixon, Carter wins in part because of Watergate, and Biden wins in part because of the coronavirus.
Right.
Not duplicable. Everything that was done to Trump during the period that he was out of office had the perverse effect of strengthening Trump. First, with the Republican Party, because in ways that I did not fully appreciate were going to happen, it was implicitly making the case that he had made from the beginning of his run for president in 2015, that the system was rigged, and it was rigged against him, and if it was rigged against him, it would be rigged against you. And then what happened?
They proved
Inflation went up, and Nancy Pelosi is eating ice cream out of a $15,000 freezer. She has a photograph taken of herself eating ice cream out of a $15,000 freezer around about the same time, or a year after, Gavin Newsom, having shut California down, goes and has dinner at the restaurant that you and I once laboriously went to in Napa Valley called the French Laundry. We drove many hours together to go to this
20
restaurant.
Courses, each
and
one
20
this big.
courses.
Delicious,
yes.
but this big.
And it was amazing. But there he is after he shuts everybody else down. And the idea that the system was rigged for these guys, he was the objective correlative of that. And that turned out, though it was good for him, we said, okay, well, that'll work with Republicans, but it's not going to work with the general electorate. And then, guess how the system is rigged? They're trying to run this senile guy.
Yeah.
We've been saying for 2 years that he's senile. I've said it from January 2023 on my podcast with no political interest whatsoever, just I'm watching him. And they say, no. And then end of June 2024, he has the debate, and they pull the switcheroo. And then what does that say to the electorate? It says,
it really is rigged.
It's
really rigged.
It's all a game to them. Yeah. They're just trying to hold on to power.
Henry.
So these two go together. It's not, therefore, a realigning election. The realignment, according to Henry, it's not really a realignment because, as I say, part of the partisanship is more defining than it used to be, but not quite as defining. But it's not a realigning election, but it is an election that confirms the idea that Democrats can no longer simply run a competent campaign and assume that they have better than even odds of winning
Henry,
an election.
The person of Donald Trump. This actually, we have one view, we have another view. Where do you put FDR? And the realignment of the 30s is impossible without FDR.
Correct.
What happened in the 80s was not a realignment, but Democrats began voting Republican. This is impossible without Ronald Reagan. The 80s, no Reagan, no 80s. So it is of importance to this town, to questions of policy. Is this man a major figure, one of these large figures who seems to come along about once every half century, and if that's the case, you make one set of calculations if you're John Thune trying to run the Senate majority, and you make one set of calculations if you're Speaker Mike Johnson. But if he's a very flawed human being, and the country happened to unite behind him, and he's already beginning to overreach by nominating Matt Gaetz, and nominating Pete Hegseth, and nominating Tulsi Gabbard, and over-interpreting this election result as all about him, then if you're John Thune and Mike Johnson, you make different kinds of calculations. So it is important to try to figure out how big is he, and your view is?
He is clearly a historical figure, but what remains to be written is whether he's a successful historical figure, is that he has done things that no one thought possible outside of the realm of fiction. That if you were in this town in
we are in graphic novel territory, aren't we?
Yeah. Well, that's what I've described. I started calling for a working class Republican Party in 2010. Saying that this was our future. We had to change on economics. We had to change on culture. It was the only way to keep this country from falling into the grips of the left. And of course, I was met with rapturous applause. Not, okay? Donald Trump is and remains the graphic novel version of what I've been calling for. But at the heart of that is that this is what America needs. In Donald Trump, in his brusqueness, in his rudeness, but also in his directness and his courage, which is what comes out in that Grace Under Fire.
There is really no denying that moment, is there?
No, it's just an unbelievable moment. And you take a look at that and you say, he convinced the people who had felt dispossessed for a long time that he was the man to trust. And let's not put, 12 years ago, the common wisdom in this town was that you either had to become more libertarian on your economics and more Christian in your social policy, or you had to basically sell out to the left. That's what the autopsy was. And Donald Trump.
The autopsy is after Mitt Romney loses. The Republican grandees get together and
Right, and they say that
called the autopsy.
The autopsy is, we need more of the Hispanic vote, so we need to give them immigration. We need more of the youth votes. We need to give them same-sex marriage. And Donald Trump actually doing the best among Latinos in history. Yeah. No one would have thought that's possible. But actually, if you understood Latinos as opposed to your, I've never met a Latino, never been to a community, but I like tacos, person here in Washington. You would have understood that. And so you can't deny that Donald Trump brought this about. And I would say Reagan was a semi-realignment, because before Ronald Reagan, there was no possibility that any form of conservative Republican or any form of Republican that was consistent could obtain power. The Democrats had massive majorities in the Senate. They controlled virtually all of the states. They controlled the House of Representatives. And what you saw was that from that moment in 1980, when Reagan convinces people, the Republican Party ran partisan ads in 1980 saying, vote Republican, period, for a change, period. And the dual meaning was intended. You go from a 22-point gap in 1980 to a 3-point gap in 1985. And the rest of our period is fought with the Democrats having the upper ground, but not the commanding heights. And that's what enables the Republicans to capture the House for most of the last 3 decades. That enables them to not be a one-off in the Senate, but a consistent force in the Senate. That's what enables them to go from virtually having no power in the states to dominating in the states. It was a semi-realignment, and you could only get power as a Democrat by interpreting Ronald Reagan. That was what Bill Clinton learned. Right. And so Donald Trump has set us up for the possibility of that. But the realigning election is never the first election, it's the second election. 1932 set up 1936. Franklin Roosevelt screws up the economy, the realignment doesn't happen. Ronald Reagan screws up, 1984 doesn't happen, the realignment doesn't happen. Donald Trump has the chance to build a realigning majority for his successor.
But he needs to deliver.
He needs to deliver, but he doesn't need to deliver in the way the establishment expects. His voters want change. They're willing to break the system. And that means unconventional ideas like tariffs, like deportations.
Wait, so you're saying these nominations that Andy mentioned of Pete Hegseth and Matt Gaetz Tulsi, that's not overreading the election results. That's a correct reading of the election's results. The country returned Donald Trump to break furniture.
Yeah, and these people may not, the biggest problem with these people is that they may be incompetent at breaking furniture because he's choosing the wrong type of disruptor.
Well, that I think is the important point, which is, you know who wanted to break furniture? Donald Rumsfeld, when he went to the Pentagon in 2001. Donald Rumsfeld had an entire plan for the complete overhaul of the Pentagon.
The revolution in military affairs.
That was halted by 9/11, when you actually had to then fight a war and therefore, revolutionizing. And he tried to do both at the same time, which was
didn't work.
Which was a fool's errand. Bill Barr, whom Trump now reviles, wanted to break furniture at Justice,
as Attorney
but he's
General.
a phlegmatic, but quietly. So Gaetz is all, I'll break furniture. Oh, now what? Like, it's like he's going to break furniture, but he's
Where's
not
the furniture
the guy.
break? How do I do this? Right. Okay.
That's why what Henry said is so important. I do think this election was a judgment on one of the worst presidencies in American history, judging by results. Trump, therefore, has a kind of a low bar. If he just doesn't screw it all up and things remain relatively even-keeled, the economy does okay to pretty well, he fulfills some of his promises on deportations and immigration, which, by the way, will be very easy to fulfill. So we're talking about deportations, right? So there are 15 million people theoretically to deport.
15 million people here illegally.
Right, okay. So let's say,
undocumented.
Let's say that when all is said and done, he only deports 500,000 of them.
Yeah.
There's no voice on the other side that is going to say,
should have been more.
You haven't done enough. You're a bum. Come to me, I'll deport more people. They're saying, no human being should be deported. And so his bar on immigration is stunningly low. He can clear it with simply by doing a couple of things. And the effect of that will be there will be self-deportation, and the flooding of the border will stop because the idea will be the authorities are going to come after you if you come across the border. Why bother? And so he's set up for success there. Tariffs is the big question for me with you, because tariffs is the thing. That is the disruptive element in modern neoliberal economics. If he goes to tariffs, he is breaking the chain of a kind of 40-year consensus on how to approach.
There was some interview just before the election, sorry, I can't remember exactly where it was, where he was pushed on tariffs. By the way, to his credit, he sat down for a lot of interviews in which people did push him, not in a directly confrontational Mike Wallace of the old 60 Minutes way, but you sit down for an hour with a podcaster and you get led into territory where you might, okay. But he got pushed on tariffs and he said, no, there won't be any tariffs. Well, wait a minute, you're calling it, no, there won't be any tariffs, was Trump's answer. I'm paraphrasing, of course. What do you mean there won't be any tariffs? Well, because all you have to do to avoid a tariff is move your factory to this country, and that's what everybody will do. Yeah. So again, it's extremely hard to know quite what he's pledged himself to do.
Right. Or our enemies or our rivals or whatever will moderate their behavior,
right,
and stop stealing our intellectual property and stop doing this, that, and the other thing, and therefore I won't impose tariffs. They will self-tariff or some version of that, so that I don't have to do it. But he has to, for this realignment, for the 1936 election to happen for J.D. Vance or whoever is his successor. That's the election where Roosevelt won 48 states, right?
Right. 46.
46, excuse me, because there were only 48 then, right? As goes Maine, so goes Vermont.
Exactly.
Was that it?
Yes.
Interestingly, not the states you would say today would be the ones that would go the other way. He has to succeed or be seen.
Okay. We come back to that in a moment. First, however, Andrew, the media. Again, two quotations. Do you like this two quotation thing? No, don't tell me. Don't tell me.
Tit for tat.
The first comes from someone who believes in legacy journalism enough to have purchased the Washington Post in 2013 and to have subsidized it ever since. In an essay the Post published in late October, Jeff Bezos, the owner, and of course the founder of Amazon. In annual public surveys, journalists have regularly fallen near the very bottom, often just above Congress. But in this year's Gallup poll, we have managed to fall below Congress. Our profession is now the least trusted, all right? Second quotation from venture capitalist David Sachs, someone who lives out in my neck of the woods in Northern California. This is a bankruptcy moment for the legacy media. They shrieked Nazi, fascist, traitor, and insurrectionist at the top of their lungs, and the country didn't believe it. The spell is broken. Close quote. Well, the Washington Post, the New York Times, ABC, CBS, NBC, the whole legacy media, what does this mean? Is the spell broken?
Well, I don't think the spell has been there for a long time. You remember this, I mean, beating up on the press, it goes back to Nixon as a successful strategy. And of course, the press ended up winning that one. But
well, that's the point. And they also made a lot of money. CBS, NBC, the New York, those were all profitable enterprises in those days.
Right. But I think this is simply an acknowledgement of what's already happened. There isn't a singular media anymore. That doesn't mean that the establishment media, the legacy media, is without a business model or anything. You know, you forget, I mean, there were still 70 million people plus who voted for Democrats.
Yes, exactly.
And the New York Times probably makes more money now than it ever has, because it wisely positioned itself as not as the newspaper of record, but as the newspaper of certain kinds of readers.
Of whom there are plenty.
Of whom there are plenty to make a living. And now the Washington Post hasn't been able to figure out how to do that, and I'm kind of surprised. I mean, they still lose money hand over fist. The network news people are going to die simply by virtue of technological changes that make it kind of inconvenient to watch the TV news. But there is still a huge market for liberal-leaning reporting and commentary.
Okay, let me put it to you in a slightly different way. Journalism broadly construed. I visited my own alma mater, Dartmouth College, last year, and I spent an evening talking to the kids who run the Dartmouth Review, which is the conservative student newspaper. And I said, very impressive kids, really wonderful, impressive kids. And show of hands, how many of you want to go into journalism? And not only did not a single hand go up, but I got blank faces as if to say, what a strange question to ask. And in my generation, and Paul Gigot, who's the editor of the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal, Paul and I were at Dartmouth College together. In my generation, lots of us wanted to go into journalism. It still felt like there was a career to be had there, and meaning and fun and excitement. And it's gone. And does this not, A, break your heart, and B, worry you a little bit about the nature of democracy? Who's going to be doing investigative reporting? Who's
Yeah, there's a
or am I overwrought about the whole
there's
business?
a real problem there. But that's almost
Is that a separate matter? Or
a technical problem. I mean, you really are not going to have farm teams at local news levels for people who have to sit on their butts for 3 hours at the local county board meeting and write down what is said. Now we're going to have AI do that, evidently. Cover the high school sports team. That's how you learn a lot, or how people traditionally have learned how to become reporters. If all of that rung in the ladder is stripped away, journalism is going to have a very hard time. But again, that's not an ideological matter or a political matter. That's a technological thing.
Is your heart broken, boys?
My heart is so unbroken. My heart swells. Let me tell you a story, Peter.
All right, you tell me. I've told a story. You tell a story, John.
In 1982, when I was 21 years old, I wrote my first book proposal. And the book proposal was on the dishonesty of 60 Minutes. Then the most powerful, the #1 television show in the United States, ranked #1, above MASH. I mean, it was the most
number
successful.
one, not just the number
not
one
just
news
news.
show.
It was the
number
number
one full stop.
And if you remember, the 60 Minutes had a technique. They had this. They investigated people. They brought them in. They sweated. The people sweated. They cut the interviews.
Close up on
right.
the sweat on your forehead.
Right. And so I had this idea for a book on writing about the dishonesty of 60 Minutes, and there was a conservative foundation that wanted to support it. And I went around to publishing houses, and people said, we can't publish that. There's no way on earth we could publish that. It's a very interesting idea, but we can't be in that relation with CBS or 60 Minutes. It's too dangerous. Why do I mention this? Because 42 years ago, people like me and Andy, when he started writing for the American Spectator, Andy wrote a column for me for 4 years on the media. We have been doing nothing but talking about the depredations of the mainstream media our entire careers as unconventional people in the mainstream media. I mean, I've worked in mainstream publications. I worked at Time. I worked at U.S. News. I've worked at conservative publications. I worked at the Washington Times. I've worked at the New York Post.
He has a hard time holding a job, this man.
It's terrible. And I worked at, Andy and I worked together at the Weekly Standard, which we helped start together, which was a magazine of opinion, but had a lot of reporting in it. And the topic that is the most enduring, because the Soviet Union disappeared and abortion has disappeared, and I don't know what else has disappeared. The enduring topic of fascination for all of us is the misbehavior of the liberal media, and the degradation of it and the self-destruction of it is devoutly to be wished. Now, like all destructions,
But now what are we going to do?
Okay, but wait, like all destructions, I think all thought that Roe v. Wade was a disgraceful and destructive constitutional atrocity.
1973 Supreme Court decision creating a right to abortion.
Right, that the decision was a constitutional atrocity, and that the proper treatment of it by the Supreme Court ultimately would be that it would be overturned. And that happened.
That
in
happened
2022.
2 years ago in 2022.
Right.
Dobbs.
Right.
Correct.
Okay. Then it's a total crap show, because this happens, and then you have to figure out what comes next. Like you said, Trump is uninterested in abortion. Trump's claim is, hey, You all wanted me to get rid of Roe v. Wade. I appointed 3 justices. We got rid of Roe v. Wade. Salute
Over to
me,
you.
celebrate me.
Right.
Now it's up to you. As for me, I think some of these restrictions you want to put on are too, that's my opinion. They're too severe. But that's what you wanted from me, and that's what I gave you. Similarly with the media, the slow motion destruction of the structure of the media over the last century has created nothing but chaos, and out of that chaos will come something better, not
less
worse.
Pompous, less
I'm
self-regarding.
I'm sorry that people aren't going to go work on the paper in Springfield, Ohio, so that that there's no paper in Springfield, Ohio, so that the local guy could cover whether or not the dogs are being eaten by the Haitians or not. One of the things that would have happened had there been a paper in Springfield, Ohio, maybe there is a paper in Springfield, Ohio, I don't even know. But there used to be a whole system of training journalists that will not take place anymore. But the system created a funnel, and the funnel, like all funnels in corporate, the worlds of corporate, were who could slither their way up through the funnel, not who was best at it, not who was the one who could be the least offensive to the greatest number of people, to get themselves highlighted and spotlighted by the people who shared their priors and believed the same things that they believed, and therefore made things like the rise of Trump not only invisible to us all, but shocking. And I submit to you that Donald Trump, from 2010 onward, was preparing long before Obama insulted him at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, which was Trump started going on media that were invisible to us. He was going on Alex Jones. He was appearing at UFC fights and talking to the commentators. He was going on local talk radio. Roger Stone was booking him on these shows. He spent 5 years building up a constituency in a world that I called proletarian media, so that the minute that he actually pulled the trigger and started running for president, he was at 15% in the polls in the Republican Party. Name another person that would have, you could say, well, he was Donald Trump, so he was on The Apprentice.
I can name another person.
Yeah.
I can name another person. That's like Ronald Reagan's weekly radio talks that were ignored in all the media capitals. Nobody in New York ever paid any attention to it, but they were listening to Ronald Reagan in Moline and Des Moines. And so, Henry, you on the media, do you have anything to add to these two august figures?
Look,
do you share John's Schadenfreude, the best Freud of them all?
Look, the liberal media brought it on themselves. They brought it on themselves by stopping to be journalists and starting to be partisans and mouthpieces. And it's true in the television stations. It's true in the elite radio stations. It's true in the elite newspapers and in many of the non-elite newspapers. But they had to deal with something that is something none of them had to think about, which is that the heyday of modern media is a technological accident of limitation of spectrum space for television and the elimination of what used to be the case in America, which is multiple competing dailies. Washington, D.C. had 4 competing dailies in the 1930s.
New York had 11.
New York had 11. So what happens is everybody looks at this rosy period, which was an accident. Now you have competition. What they were from the 1960s to the 1990s was the media version of the department store. You used to have a department store that would, be the entity in each local area getting together. You get your housewares, you get your furniture, you get your clothes, everything together, and they would make the selections for you, and the scale would produce cheaper prices. What happens? Affluence destroys the model. You can go out and you can buy exactly what type of things you can want at a boutique clothing store or at a boutique furniture store on the higher end. So the higher end departs the department store. The lower end finds, well, Walmart can get something that I can afford better, that I like better at a better price. The department store is destroyed by competition. And it's still being destroyed by competition. The legacy media was the department store that is destroyed by high-end competition and low-end competition. And the New York Times has adapted by basically becoming a boutique. A boutique for progressives and people who like, I may not like the politics, but I like the arts section.
And they like cooking and they like games. And
which the New York Times also sells.
It's not. Also, it's not separately. You can get
cooking. You have to.
okay, but the game
He must know
people,
because he's
2 million people a day do the Times spelling bee. 2 million people a day.
No, excuse me, that's my wife. She's doing it 2 million times.
But that's what I'm saying is, like, in that sense, you're exactly right that what happened.
Hold on.
Yeah, okay.
Let me ask, closing question
Yes.
about the media, because I want to get back to Trump for just a kind of closing.
Yeah.
It's occurring to me now. Michael Barone makes the point that from the founding of the country through much of the 19th century, the point you make, that every small town in the country had 2 or 3 different newspapers, and the newspapers tended to be quite partisan. The so-and-so Democrat, the such-and-such Republican. And the country was fine.
Right.
The country was fine. The economy grew, the democracy was boisterous, but the country was fine. You are fundamentally not worried. Whatever is a-borning is going to be okay with regard to media and journalism. And I can't even bring a tear to your eye.
No, I think we're going to miss it when it's gone.
I'm going to miss it. But, I miss a lot of things. I miss the old Hollywood. I miss publishing better books. I miss a lot of the cultural, the things that I had that were the
My point is
cultural
slightly
hallmarks.
different. It's going to make our jobs harder. You go through past issues of Commentary, National Review, the American Spectator, all of right-wing media is absolutely parasitic in a way. I mean, that's a bad word to use. On the mainstream media and the New York Times and CBS News and the Washington Post. What's going to happen to all of that infrastructure when you take that central organism away from it?
I think that the reason to be optimistic is that there was a lot of chaff in that wheat, and a lot of that chaff was poisonous, and that what we need with the wheat will be repurposed in ways that we don't entirely know yet, but
You agree.
that there'll be different chaff, and we already know what the chaff is now. The chaff is Tucker. The chaff is Tucker Carlson. The chaff is
Alex Jones.
Is Alex Jones. But I mean, the chaff is people who are peddling not only lies, but kind of their own version of what I would consider the demonization of the United States and the West and things like that. But there's going to be a lot of wheat. It's just that we're living through the
Commentary
disruption.
podcast.
Thank you very much.
You take over a storied magazine as editor, and now you've launched a commentary podcast. But I don't know how many listeners you have, but you've got one at this table that I know of.
Thank you. Yes.
Okay. So, boys, can I add, you touched on a point. Last round of questions. Although we could, well, who knows? Let's go talk for 2 hours more. We'll let the editors worry about cutting the show down to length.
Why are you cutting the show? It's online.
It's good point. People can cut it themselves.
Joe Rogan's like 4 hours. Since
Oh,
they were
please.
4
Oh,
hours.
start.
Bring
Don't
out.
start.
Where's your
Don't-
joint? Let's
don't
all
start.
smoke a joint. We'll
Thank
be
you,
just
John.
like Joe
Could
Rogan.
you please get him under control? What do you miss?
Get him high.
I won't. This is not the last of the last questions. What I was thinking about this the other day. Well, as I was making these notes to ask you guys, and I thought to myself, I miss working for people who had served in, or at least had vivid memories of, the Second World War. Ronald Reagan did not do combat duty. His vision relegated him to a morale, but he still served. He wore a uniform. He produced morale films. George H.W. Bush served in a perfectly heroic fashion.
Missions.
58 missions, one of which he was shot down. And I realized these men for whom, they were large figures to us, of course, but we knew them, we worked for them. And looking back on it, I think to myself that we were surrounded by figures who at some ultimate visceral level understood the stakes. They'd seen what could happen when it all slid off the table. Do you think that's true?
I think that, look,
In other words, that there's something that the people haven't been through what those people have been. Well, we work for guys who came up during the Depression and then went off to fight a war and then came home to rebuild the country. That sort of epic is missing now.
well, it's the epic is missing in part because of the great success of the United States since 1945.
Well, that's right.
Is that
It's missing because they didn't want us to live through it.
right? And it's people who lived through the excitement of the Reagan administration has the closest thing to the epic. When I was growing up, I never thought that we were going to win the Cold War without a fight.
Yeah.
And instead we win the Cold War without a shot, much less without a fight.
Much
the
less
economy
if the
gets
Republicans would take the House.
That was
when we were growing up, nobody talked about mutual funds, nobody talked about entrepreneurship, and suddenly you've got this dynamic, innovative economy that did not exist when we were growing up. Thank you, Ronald Reagan. We have this peaceful American primacy world that is fading because primacy is unnatural in human affairs, but it gave us a period of peace and a lack of stakes in global affairs. Thank you, Ronald Reagan. So people who live, I understand why people who worked during that era look nostalgically at the greatness. But no, we have not lived through great times. We are about ready to go into challenging and great times. And when we come through them, which we will, the people who are in their 20s will look at the people in their 40s through their 60s and say they're walked giants.
Okay, here comes, you have just set it up. This is going to be the last question, and here's how it's going to work. Henry, John, Andy. This means that while the two of them are talking, you can make notes surreptitiously if you'd like. Here's the last question then. Again, I was thinking this over and I thought my mind was running in exactly the grooves you just laid out for us. 2 decades, 1970s, stagflation, reversal in the Cold War as the Soviets advance in Asia and Latin America and Africa, and the collapse in national morale. I looked this up. Jimmy Carter, in June of 1979, the famous Malaise speech, the threat is I'm quoting him now, this is the President of the United States, the threat is a crisis of confidence. It strikes at the very heart of our national will. And in 1979, the Soviets invade Afghanistan and Iranians take Americans hostage. 1 decade later, which in historic terms is nothing, it's the blink of an eye. 1 decade later, by 1989, we undergo a renewal, economic expansion, rebuild the military, recapturing national morale. That 1984 re-election slogan, "Morning Again in America," sounds hopelessly corny to my kids, but it rang true enough to voters to give Ronald Reagan 49 out of 50 states. 1979, the Soviets invade Afghanistan and the Iranians take Americans hostage, and 1989, the Berlin Wall falls. Are we capable? What I find so riveting about your analysis of this election that we just went through is that it almost suggests to my limited mind that the political predicate for a period of really sustained renewal has now fallen into place. Are we capable? Is there some possibility that we stand at the beginning of a renewal today like the one we went through in the 80s?
Of course, because we're Americans. It's the American heritage. What it requires is leadership and political will. I think that's what Americans yearn for. I think they've been given people who have promised leadership, and they have been given fecklessness for 20 to 30 years. And Donald Trump promises that sort to a large number of people, shocks and offends a number of people who would be open to a different type of leader. But I think he has broken the system enough so that real dramatic, just like Ronald Reagan failed in the 60s and the 70s, but when the time met the man in 1980, he was capable of stepping up. I don't know if Trump is capable of stepping up. I know his vice president is.
John, renewal.
I think when people look back at this period 100 years from now, they will look back on this period the way we looked back at the end of the 20th century to the end of the 19th century, by which I mean the period between 1875 and 1900 was the worst period in American political history in the sense that we had extraordinarily undistinguished presidents. We had
50-50 country.
We had a 50-50 country. We had assassinations. We had the Grover Cleveland in, out, in that Trump has now duplicated. Massive amounts of immigration, incredible disruption, rise of populism, the Populist Party, Tom Watson, the fight over the gold standard and all of that.
Corruption.
And nobody remembers any of those people unless you are a historian or somebody. What do they know about 1875 to 1900? It was the period in which the United States became the richest country in the world. It built the railways, telephony, the automobile, and eventually in 1903, flight. And what we know about America was it was the most innovative country on earth. It was the revolution that changed everything for the next 100 years. And the politics are inconsequential. And it's my view that what will matter in 2124 is Elon Musk catching the rocket that was shot up and down, the development of the completely interconnected communications world that is causing so much difficulty and so much disruption and teenage suicides because social media is so terrible, and all of that stuff that these revolutionary periods like the Industrial Revolution caused. Living through the disruption is awful. You think that the world is coming to an end, and in fact, you are just in transit from one period to another. So if I'm right about this, no one will remember Barack Obama except that he was the first black president. No one will remember Joe Biden will be a trivia question, and Donald Trump will be this kind of, boy, that was weird. This crazy guy came in and did crazy things, and that was one of the marks that everything else was happening elsewhere, that the people who might have been the leaders that you're talking about might have gone into public service after World War II. They didn't go into public service.
The kids who didn't raise their hand at Dartmouth because they didn't want to be journalists are all headed off to venture capital.
Venture capital, or they want to create something. So that's the joke, right? It's they want to. When I was a kid, people wanted to go to Hollywood. Now they want to make an app. But like the person who wants to make an app, who knows what that app will be or what that means. So I have this terrific optimism that politics. Now the problem is in the 1870s and 1880s, the federal government was a tiny. Little nothing, and now
there was no Xi Jinping, there was no Vladimir Putin,
right?
There was no crisis.
No, but there was Karl Marx. There were the revolutionaries of throughout Europe who were going to destroy, and we were going to end up in World War I. Not we, America, but the world was going to end up in World War I, which was going to. So all I'm saying is that my feeling is that, with the exception of the fact that we're going to somehow have to pay down this national debt, and we're about to hit this fiscal cliff that is going to destroy.
John, I love the argument, but I just can't. The federal government is just too big and too much in hock, and too much in our lives to. All right, go ahead.
Elon Musk bought Twitter for $54 billion and didn't go broke. Explain to me how that's possible. Why? But
he has a lot of money. That's what it is.
Andrew Ferguson, National Renewal. Or do you find the question, if I framed it in a hysterical manner in the first place?
No, I think it's a serious, real question. And my sort of fatuous, trite answer is, you just never bet against America. It's just stupid. And I think it will, but it's based on a couple of things. One is a free economy in which the labor markets are kept free, capital is allowed to go where it needs to go to be most usefully deployed. If you've got that on the one hand, and then you have the character of the people, because this is one of the things that John is referring to, is you need good character to take advantage of the free economy. And the free economy depends on the good character of the people.
Personal sacrifice,
and this is why, I mean, as silly as some people think my never Trumpism is actually very important to me, I think, because he is the president. We look at presidents in different ways. He is a man of manifestly terrible character. I'll grant you the physical courage. And he is surrounding himself with people of bad character. And that has to have some kind of influence on the second part that I was talking about, which is the character of the country itself, of people. Maybe, I think we'll survive him. I think he's kind of silly enough that he won't have any long-lasting effect in that regard. But I don't know.
Well, can I speak to that? Because so what you're talking about freeing the economy. I think one of the things we haven't even talked about, like the main issue, people are talk today on my podcast for an hour about transgenderism. The most important issue in this election, dealing with, aside from inflation, in my view, given where the votes were that Trump needed to win, was fracking, was energy. Energy was the hidden issue of this election, and the story of the last...
Did it drive Pennsylvania?
No.
No?
It helped, but Pennsylvania is not dependent on fracking outside of a few small counties. What drove Pennsylvania was the same things that drove elsewhere. He gained dramatically among Puerto Ricans in Philadelphia and Reading. He increased vote share in non-fracking areas across the board among blue-collar voters.
What I mean is that in 2007, the United States began doing hydraulic fracturing.
Correct.
This is the most important geopolitical development of the 21st century.
Because within 5 years we were energy
we're energy independent, energy exporters. We killed the power of the Gulf states. There would have been a time when what happened in Venezuela, which was the fourth largest oil exporter in the world,
would have mattered.
Everything that happened in Venezuela would be front page news because Venezuela was so important to the world economy. And now Venezuela, which is just had another stolen election. Does anyone even know who the name of the guy that the election was stolen from? We don't pay any attention. Part of the story has been a fight between the Republican Party to unleash fracking, to take the handcuffs off fracking, and the Democratic Party desperately attempting to handcuff frackers and to retard the advance.
Right.
Okay, so if I bring this up only to say that the character issues here are we unleashing the American people, or are we attempting to control and contain the American people? And the character of the president matters because in this case, that's a different form of handcuffing. If we have morally compromised leadership, it makes the job of America's advance harder because it does say you can gull your way through things, you can lie, you can cheat, he did it, it's okay, there are no consequences for your actions as long as you get powerful enough. These are terrible lessons for people to learn. But they're a form of bad restraint. They unleash bad things as opposed to good things. And so I do think Andy's right. We can't just say it's fine that Trump it doesn't matter that he's a person of bad character. But I think it's one of these things that you have to cope with, the way you have to cope with and fight the people who want to say, it's terrible that we are making America the most important country in the world when it comes to producing natural energy and gas, which still runs the world.
Okay. The question, Andy said he's surrounding himself, the president-elect is surrounding himself with bad people. You put it more eloquently. But about half of the nominees are actually quite impressive people, aren't they? Marco Rubio. So how do you balance this question of character? You're a political analyst. You talk about polls. Character is a little bit out of your usual bailiwick, but you'd grant that its importance.
No, I mean, it's one thing to study
elections. Who's the man who just got... So it's Doug Burgum at the Department of the Interior, and Sean Duffy is going to be energy? Transportation. Who just got named energy?
Fracking guy.
A fracking guy. And Trump has established a National Energy Council, all these very impressive...
Under Burgum.
Under Burgum. And all those guys are tremendously...
Burgum was a former energy exec.
Yeah, and these are all tremendously impressive people. Okay, so the question of character, sorry. How do you weigh
it?
Look,
question of character... I think we put too much importance on the character of one person and not enough importance on the character of the people. Is that one of the things I keep hearing about is, I talk about the possibility of American renewal, and I say, we're not capable of it. The American people are debauched. The American people are this. The American people are not. Do I wish that Donald Trump were more of an upstanding, honest person? Absolutely. Do I think that the flip side of his ruthlessness is a degree of determination that has taken on the most concerted, detrimental, ill-intended onslaught of elites since Franklin Roosevelt and taken them to task? Unfortunately, yes. Look, no one looks at Franklin Roosevelt and says his private life was a matter of, this is a guy who had multiple affairs and was known for being notoriously duplicitous.
He was not a saint.
He was not a saint. And he was a man who could say in 1936 that his opposition were united in their hate for him, and he welcomed their hatred. Donald Trump, if he were more eloquent, could say that, and he would have every justification of doing so. I think the American people are ready for renewal. I think the American people hunger for renewal, and I believe that if Trump is successful, he will set up J.D. Vance to be that Trump will be Moses. He will lead America to the renewal, and Vance will provide it.
Andy, hallelujah.
I heard him compared to King David in the first term. This is the first time I've heard him compared to Moses.
So
I gotta say,
he's much taller.
Last question for you. We came here, the three of us. You were in politics. You fit, but we knew each other all these years ago. We came to Washington in the 80s because we wanted in. We felt there was something big and exciting happening, and we wanted in. I don't know about you, but I work at the Hoover Institution, which is in the middle of the Stanford campus, and I have received emails from kids saying, how do I get my resume in front of somebody in the Trump transition team? What's your advice to some 22 or 23 or 24-year-old kid who's us today, who says, something big is happening. I want to move to Washington.
I hate to say this, but I've had that conversation.
You must have.
I would wave them off because I think that Trump is a bomb that could go off at any time, and you never know what the collateral damage is going to be. And I think people can, if Trump succeeds, one of the great things that will happen is a devaluing of the importance of politics and government, sort of along the lines that you were saying. And if that's the case, you're better off going out into the country and, even though it hurts my property values, you're better off going out into the country and trying to build a business or, start a soup kitchen or something like that. I really don't, I think it's dangerous to be here with him at the top.
All right, you get the last word. Andrew Ferguson, Henry Olsen, John Podhoretz, all three of you very close friends. I'm grateful for the chance to jabber. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
For Uncommon Knowledge, the Hoover Institution, and Fox Nation, I'm Peter Robinson.